Hey everyone, my name is Sam Sharp, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about queering biology. I am going to be talking a lot during this presentation, but I really would love to have all of your participation. So if you have questions or comments at any point during the presentation, feel free to unmute yourself or comment in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. And as we're getting started, if you just want to briefly introduce yourself in the chat. So if in Colorado or somewhere else and what you do and what brought you to the conference, I'd be super interested in that. Okay, so while people are hopefully going to introduce themselves in the chat, I will get started with my presentation because I want to respect everyone's time. It's been a long day of hopefully really quality learning and community building opportunities for everyone. I know I've learned a lot from this conference so far. So a little bit about me. My name is Sam Sharp. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a PhD candidate studying biology at the State University. And if you want to connect with me on Twitter or on YouTube, I am at Plant Role Models. So I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement for where I am right now, which is on stolen land. That's the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations, the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska. I've adapted my land acknowledgement from the K-State Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance. And if you are in a different place than me, you can use the nativeland.ca tool to figure out which ancestral lands you're on. I'd also like to make a note that as we discuss cultivating respectful attitudes and practices to support sex and gender diversity, we acknowledge that European colonists historically targeted, stigmatized, and oppressed Indigenous peoples for having cultural gender roles beyond the male-female binary, and that this violence continues today. Next, I'd like to give an overview of my presentation. So I'll start talking about sort of giving an introduction to this topic. I'll talk about diversity in biology in general. Then I'll talk about classification. Then I'll talk about sex diversity, specifically human sex diversity. I'll talk a little bit about gender. Because this isn't for a necessarily academic audience, I'm not going to really talk about how to translate this into the classroom unless anyone has specific questions about that. And then I'll end with a summary. And I'd also like to make a note that some of the topics that I'm talking about might be activating. So just so everyone is aware that these topics will be discussed. And if you need to mute the presentation or step away, I encourage you to take care of yourself. So I'd like to start off discussing this topic with a quote from the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, who writes, "We learn about worlds when they do not accommodate us. Not being accommodated can be pedagogy. We generate ideas through the struggles we have to be in the world, and we come to question worlds when we are in question." And much of this presentation will cover questions that I felt obligated to ask due to the ways that as a queer, trans, and intersex biologist, I have not felt accommodated in my field and in the ways that people talk about biology. So frequently when biological sex is discussed, either in biology classrooms in high schools or the first class that people will take in college, generally the last time that people get an academic explanation of what biology is, sex in humans is presented as something that is binary, chromosomal, and fixed at birth, coming in only 2 flavors. And when we talk about gender and sexuality, this isn't usually explicitly discussed as sexuality in the biology classroom. But if we look at something like this, which is a diagram of a human reproductive cycle, we see the use of gendered terms to describe the parents who contribute different types of gametes to the next generation. And we see what constitutes a heterosexual reproductive event. And when this is the way that biological sex, gender, and sexuality is discussed frequently in the media, in politics, and often in the classrooms where most people who are not biologists get their last academic exposure to biology, I want us to consider who is left out of this and who might feel like biology doesn't suit them if this is the only way that they're taught. I also want to ask, what are the consequences of this? And there's some significant consequences that occur for students. There's statistics that show that there's higher attrition rates of LGBTQIA+ students from STEM fields by the time they graduate from college, even though they show significant interest in these topics as judged by participation in research. And we also know that when biology is taught this way, it can create uncomfortable classroom environments for queer and trans and intersex students. And it can also make students who are not part of that community, so cisgender, heterosexual, endosex students, not question whether their sex, gender, and sexuality is the only normal, natural, or biological way to exist. But even beyond the effects on students, this type of understanding, or rather misunderstanding of biology, has really significant and insidious consequences. So this is a map showing all of the states that had anti-transgender legislation last year, with a total of over 100 pieces proposed. Many have already been proposed this year. So I want to acknowledge a comment in the chat about perisex versus endosex. I would say that they are basically interchangeable to refer to non-intersex people, though some people have a personal preference. I've tried to get away from dyadic because it encourages the idea of a binary. And these anti-trans legislation passed in at least 8 states in 2021. And the purpose of most of this legislation was to do one of 3 things: to prevent transgender girls from being able to play women's sports, denying transgender youth gender-affirming care, or allowing medical providers to opt out of treating specific patients for quote-unquote moral reasons, which often included trans or gender nonconforming patients. And as I was putting this presentation together yesterday, I saw this headline that a similar bill preventing transgender girls and women from playing women's sports in Iowa had also passed. So this is still very much happening. And the problems that contribute to and are created by this type of legislation are really multifaceted, and the solution is more than just reconfiguring how we understand and talk about biological sex. But I think these things do actually play a significant role in the bills, especially if we zero in on the language. So something that's been getting a lot of press recently is this Texas Attorney General's stated public opinion that is encouraging the idea that trans care for minors is child abuse, and encouraging teachers, parents, and doctors who support youth receiving trans care to be prosecuted for child abuse, which is incredibly damaging. But I was curious, what is the language that's being used to explain this perspective? So some of the language in the bill says, it's important to note that it remains medically impossible to truly change the sex of an individual because this is determined biologically at conception. No doctor can replace a fully functioning male sex organ with a fully functioning female sex organ. And this indicates that the person who wrote this opinion sees sex as something that, as we previously discussed, is in humans only binary and fixed at conception, and that the purpose of sex is to have functioning male or female sex organs. This is not actually how sex legally works, as many of us know, because pursuing a change to sex markers on legal documentation is possible in most states without having to prove that you have quote unquote fully functioning male or female sex organs. And that's for many people not the primary or even at all how they experience their own sex. Additionally, there is a list of procedures here which they say are performed on children receiving trans affirming care. Interestingly, these procedures are never performed on trans children receiving gender affirming care pre-puberty, and are rarely performed on anyone under 18 who is receiving gender affirming care. They are, however, regularly performed on intersex children as young as infants without their consent. And this opinion arguing that trans care is child abuse, like most anti-trans legislations that pertain to care for children, has a carve-out for intersex people. So the text reads, some children have a medically verifiable genetic disorder of sex development or do not have the normal sex chromosome structure for male or female as determined by a physician through genetic testing that require procedures similar to those described in this request. One of the main points outlined in this opinion is that it is child abuse to perform any kind of procedure that will temporarily or permanently sterilize a child. However, these procedures, including those that result in sterilization, are regularly performed on intersex children without their consent. And this opinion, as well as, I would say, pretty much every piece of legislation seeking to ban gender-affirming care for trans children, allows the same procedures, despite all of the ways that they are said to be unethical, to be performed on intersex children without their consent. And there's a tweet that summarizes this better than how I am. So it says, surgeries do not happen on transgender children, but they do happen to intersex kids when they are too young to consent. Unwanted medical interventions enacted on intersex youth can lead them to transition later in life. So what's going on here is a prevention of access to bodily autonomy for both transgender children and intersex children based on conflicting arguments that misunderstand biological sex. And so I want to remind all of us that despite of these misunderstandings of biology and the really harmful ways that they are being used politically, biological life on Earth remains infinitely varied and inherently queer. And so in this presentation, I want to ask the question, what got us here? What got us to this really serious misunderstanding of how biology works and the use of that misunderstanding to justify removing autonomy from trans and intersex children? And then I want to ask, how do we do better? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about biology and the history of science. So what is biology? According to Google Dictionary, it is the study of living organisms divided into many specialized fields that cover their morphology, physiology, anatomy, behavior, origin, and distribution. Biology is a type of study. It's a system of knowledge. And like other systems of knowledge, it has advantages, flaws, and limitations. And when we think about who does biology, this is also significant because biologists are people who have a specific personal history, specific identities, specific positionality, and a specific set of personal biases. And in the research they do, biologists might be motivated by explicit or implicit bias. An example of explicit bias is if you read a paper that says, you know what, cheese is a superfood. And then you look at who funded that research, and it's a dairy commission. An example of implicit bias might be a team of researchers deciding that they want to study a disease that affects people like them, and say everyone on that team of researchers is a middle-aged white man, and they want to study diseases that primarily affect middle-aged white men. And if every team of researchers has a similar demographic and is motivated to study diseases that affect people like them, that's going to result in very disproportionate amounts of study and of funding towards those types of diseases at the expense of diseases that primarily affect people in other demographics. And finally, if we think about who gets to be in the room to make the decisions about what research is done and how to distribute the funding for different types of research, it's important to remember that in order to be in those rooms, you have to access a certain level of education, and you have to get through that education. And that is often limited by money. It's limited by who does not experience such significant discrimination that they end up leaving the field. And it's limited by who gets to dream that they can be part of that and see representation of people doing that type of work that looks like them. So another question I want to ask is, what are the goals of biology and what is the relationship between biology and cultural values? And a book that's really shaped my thinking on this is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I highly recommend it. And some of the things that she discusses in her book is thinking about whether the production of biological knowledge is motivated by an extractive value system, or whether it's motivated by curiosity and hypothesis testing about our biosphere that's motivated by an appreciation for beauty and the pursuit of reciprocal relationships. And this motivation can really shape how research is done and what research is done and how these findings go on to impact people's lives. Another question I want to ask is, who gets to benefit from the findings of biological research and who is harmed by the processes? And a book that gave me really important insight into this is Black on Both Sides by C. Riley Snorton. And one of the things discussed in this book is the history of gynecology and the person who is often to be the father of modern gynecology, Dr. J. Marion Sims, developed some of his procedures by repeatedly performing surgeries on enslaved Black women without anesthetic. These surgeries would later be used on class-privileged white women with anesthetic, which was in fact available at the time. So this brings up the really important point of who is used in the process of creating biological research and how are they harmed by it and who stands to benefit from it. The next question I want to ask is, how is biology done? And is the study of life. So as a biologist, you say, okay, life. You pick what kind of life you want to study, and then you can either do an experiment that's based in observing, so taking note of conditions that exist without disruption. And you can also do experimental manipulations, where you create a artificial situation that removes or adds certain variables and observes their effects. And in both observational and experimental studies, classification is very important. And so variation is in nature, but classifying variation is always a subjective decision. And I have this picture of shells on the slide because that provides kind of a simple example of this. So we can see that the shells differ from one another and also have similarities. And deciding at what point do we have to divide this into 2 or 3 categories of shells based on their differences is a subjective decision and could be made in multiple different ways. And the work that biology does as a system of power and a system of knowledge includes creating and assigning identities and classifications. And there's a quote by Karen Levy that I really like to describe this. And the quote reads, "The act of measurement is not neutral. Every technology of measurement and classification legitimates certain forms of knowledge and experience while rendering others invisible." And a big type of classification that occurs in biology is taxonomy. And some of us might have seen this before, this classification of different levels of organization of life. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I used to teach a class where this was a really component of the course. The students had to memorize it and then had to learn about different of life based on these levels of organization. The person who created this type of taxonomic organization was Linnaeus, who published a series of books called the Systema Naturae. And in the 10th edition of this book, he wrote out various different classifications for different taxa, animals, and minerals. And also wrote out classifications of different types of humans, which can be seen here. And he classified 4 categories of humans by continent and color, quote unquote, and also included descriptions of the qualities associated with each of these taxa of humans. And the way that this was done, substantial racial bias and a clear hierarchy in his mind of different types of people, showing a very early example of race science occurring out alongside the establishment of this type of classification. So thinking about different aspects of biology that are still used today, I think it's really important to know the history and to know the implicit biases, and in some cases, explicit biases that went into developing these types of classification. And a specific type of classification that is of great interest to me, and I would presume other people attending this conference, is classification of sex and gender. And many of us have come to the understanding that neither sex nor gender is binary, but it seems like this is an idea that we are continuously pushing against, as it appears in some cases in science classes and in this political rhetoric, and in the perspectives of many people who have not had the impetus to question it. And I think a lot of us don't actually know where the idea of a sex and gender binary comes from. And I didn't actually know about it either until a few years ago. And I think in some ways it's pretty surprising, but it's an important thing to discuss as we question how we can do better. So prior to the 1800s in Europe, the prevailing idea about human sex variation was that all human bodies were basically one sex. And the male sex was considered to be the deluxe amped up version, and the female sex was considered to be sort of the budget model that lacked sufficient heat to get genitals to pop out externally. However, in the 1800s, gonads were discovered, which shifted the perspective from a one-sex model to a two-sex model. Also in the 1800s, Darwin's idea of Evolution, Descent with Modification, and Survival of the Fittest were published and became well known. And so, near the end of the 1800s, some European eugenicists just tried to appropriate Darwin's ideas and apply them to human societies. And they claimed that sexual dimorphism was a racial trait. And the people who were the most supposedly sexually dimorphic and, in their eyes, the most supposedly evolved were heterosexual Europeans. And they claimed that non-white ethnic groups did not have the same level of sexual dimorphism and were therefore less evolved. They also claimed that individuals who were European but who were supposedly degenerate, including lesbians and sex workers, could also be shown to be less distinct female and less sexually dimorphic, as was evidence of their degeneracy and less evolved nature. And they supported these claims through a pseudoscience called biometrics, which consisted of body measurements that was supposedly able to prove reduction in sexual dimorphism in these populations that they wanted to claim were inferior and less evolved. And these ideas and the pseudoscience that supported them were used to justify eugenic laws and projects, which at the time were considered widely socially acceptable. Something else that happened around the turn of the century in the early 1800s was the development of genital reconstructive surgeries. So it was not only possible to classify bodies based on sex, gender, and supposedly evolution-proving levels of sexual dimorphism, but it was also possible to change this aspect of bodies. By the 1950s, the use of this surgery had sort of taken two different paths. Due to the paradigm created by Dr. John Money in the United States, this type of surgery began to be forced on any infants who were born with genitalia that didn't match a binary idea of male or female. And transgender adults who actively and consensually wanted these surgeries were subjected to extensive gatekeeping in order to access them. Interestingly, both these types of deployment of the surgeries, so forcing them on non-consenting intersex infants and gatekeeping them from consenting transgender adults, were based in homophobia, at least in part, because part of the perspective that John Money put forward was that if these surgeries were not done on intersex infants and they were allowed to grow up with bodies that didn't look like endosex bodies, they would be more likely to become homosexual, which was seen as bad. And part of the gatekeeping surrounding medical transition for transgender adults was based on the idea that they should only be allowed to transition if they could participate in society as a heterosexual version of their affirmed gender. And there has been some changes to the ways that these surgeries are deployed since then. However, even though a lot of things have changed, we still see sex and gender being racialized, sex and gender being conflated with one another, and the way that they are classified being used to deny access and autonomy to a variety of different groups of people. So some examples of this are bathroom bills and now trans sports bills, which seek to deny trans people access to their social needs and in some cases physical needs. So I have a picture here of Gavin Grimm, who got a lot of press coverage because of his trying to gain access to the appropriately gendered bathroom at his school. We also see intersex women of color being disqualified from athletics due to their naturally occurring testosterone levels. An example of this was how Christine Mvoma and Beatrice Massalingai were prevented from competing in certain Olympic events last summer because of their naturally occurring testosterone levels. And additionally, we see the required sterilization of trans people in order to access the correct legal sex on their documents in some states, and also forced hysterectomies of color in ICE detention facilities. And I could give more examples of this, but the one that I'm going to zero in on for the next slide is specifically this example of sex verification in sports, because I think it really highlights the way that sex and gender as a binary is really a myth that does not hold up to scrutiny. So again, looking back to the 1900s, around this time, there was increasing anxiety about women in athletics. Again, this has to do with white supremacist ideas about white femininity and preserving white femininity, and people literally being upset about the expressions of like pain, determination, endurance, I don't even know, that were seen on women's faces when they participated in sports. And this anxiety increased in the 1940s. And for athletes to participate in women's sports, they needed to have medical femininity certificates. And following World War II, there was a specific anxiety about communist countries trying to have male athletes pass as women to compete in women's sports and win all the medals. There was no evidence of this happening, but in response to this fear, a mandatory genital check was instituted for athletes who wanted to compete in women's sports. This was humiliating and received a lot of backlash. So in the 1960s, they switched to doing a chromosome test. However, this created a lot of problems because athletes who had variations like androgen insensitivity syndrome, who had a Y chromosome but no ability to physically respond to testosterone, were getting disqualified despite having no provable biological advantage. And so in 2005, they ended mandatory chromosome testing or any kind of mandatory sex verification testing, but enabled selective gender testing to continue. In 2011, they changed this to selective hyperandrogenism tests that could ban athletes competing in women's sports who had testosterone levels that were decided to be too high. In 2015, in response to a case brought forth by the woman in the top image, Duti Chand, who's a sprinter from India, sex verification testing was suspended, and the International Olympic Committee said that it was going to look into the research to make a more informed decision about this. And in 2018, a ruling was put forth that competitors in certain women's track events must have a blood testosterone level below 5 nanomoles per liter. And in 2019, this was further revised that competitors in certain women's track events must have a blood testosterone level below 5 nanomoles per liter if they have specific intersex variations that include XY chromosomes and testes, but not if they have other types of intersex variations. So it's very interesting to see this progression between, in order to verify that somebody is sufficiently female to compete in women's sports, there was this idea that it could be very simple. It could be done through this certificate or this physical examination, but none of these types of different tests worked very well. So they had to get more and more specific until the International Olympic Committee's official definition of what constitutes being a woman is this incredibly specific and arbitrary thing that applies only to certain track and field events. And in addition to this not working, it's important to observe that the people targeted by this tend to be women of color from the global south and frequently who do not conform to stereotypical ideas of femininity. And here we have this intersection of sex, gender, race being used to oppress a specific group of athletes. And this really is not based on science. It's based on politics and prejudice. So now that I've talked a little bit about the history of how we got to this place and how we got to this misunderstanding of sex as a binary and misunderstanding of gender as a binary that's derived directly from sex, I want to talk about how we can maybe do better. And one way that we can do better is increase our understanding of what sex is and how it works. Because if we look across the biological diversity of life, sex doesn't look like just one thing. In some organisms, just one sex exists, such as in the all-female species of New Mexico whiptail lizards. In some cases, sex exists as thousands of different types, such as in some mushrooms and the Basidiomycota that have thousands of different mating types. In some cases, we can have the ability to produce multiple different gametes in one body. So in a way, having multiple sexes in one body. This is true in some animals like snails, and this is actually more common than the alternative in flowering plants. Sex is not necessarily a fixed characteristic through an individual's entire life. Some organisms, like clownfish, can do what's called sequential hermaphroditism, where they can change from a fertile adult of one sex to a fertile adult of another sex during their lifetime. I think it's important when we talk about sex to specifically define what it means in the context that we're talking about. In many plants and animals, sex is related to gametes, so whether an organism can produce a large immobile gamete called an ova or a small mobile gamete called a sperm, or in some cases both. Organisms that can produce both are called monoecious, which means one house. Organisms that need a separate individual to produce a sperm and an ova are called dioecious, which means two houses. And in dioecious organisms, there's multiple ways to determine what type of gamete an individual will produce. In some cases, this is chromosomally determined, which you're probably most familiar with. But in other cases, it can be in response to environmental factors, like the temperature of egg incubation. And in some cases, it can have to do with social factors, such as whether or not a larva interacts with another larva of the same species while developing. When it comes to discussing human biological sex, I think it's important to be extra careful because of the history and the political implications that I've discussed. So I prefer to talk about human sex in terms of characteristics, consist of a collection of variable traits related directly or indirectly to sexual reproduction. And primary sex characteristics include sex chromosomes, what types of sex hormones and what levels we're exposed to during prenatal development, how our brain develops prenatally, and certain internal and external body structures. Even though all of these primary sex characteristics vary on a spectrum, the idea shown in this top diagram that sex only comes in two flavors and can be determined solely by external genitals at birth still prevails in the medical system. We also have secondary sex characteristics, including facial and body hair that might develop during puberty, adult body size, adult vocal range, and body shape and fat distribution. Again, all secondary sex characteristics vary along spectrums and may or may not correspond to primary sex characteristics in a binary way. And this brings me to the discussion of intersex. So I define intersex as people with physical characteristics, including gonads, chromosomes, internal or external sex organs, secondary sex characteristics, sex hormone levels, do not fit binary understandings of typical male or female biology. These traits might be visible at birth, visible at puberty, or never be visible without specific types of testing. I've often seen the percent of people who are intersex listed as 1.7% of the population, but depending on how we define intersex and what types of variations are included, I think this is likely closer to 5%. And as I said before, all human sex characteristics vary along a spectrum and have more than two possible phenotypes. And this is an inherent part of human biological diversity. So what I'm showing at the bottom of the slide is called the scale, which is used to categorize external genitals of people with a specific intersex trait called androgen insensitivity syndrome. And I like this diagram because it shows that external genitals, just like every other part of human sex, really do vary along a spectrum. And this isn't something that we see very often, I think, just because it's not acknowledged because of the prevalence of these early surgeries and because people are squeamish about genital drawings. And the reason why we see this full variation of genitals is because all human genitals develop from the primordial gonad, which is present at 6 weeks prenatal development, that has the same 4 parts in people, regardless of their sex chromosome status, and they can develop into all of these different configurations. And something else that I just want to really emphasize is that intersex people are people. These are some awesome intersex people. I've met a few of them. They're all doing great work in activism. And I think it's important to continuously acknowledge the personhood of intersex people rather than just using intersex as an argument or dehumanizing intersex people by showing pictures of them naked in medical and biology textbooks, which is something that unfortunately still happens today. So the next thing I want to discuss is the relationship between sex and gender. And this is something that is, I would say, more subjective than some of what I've discussed about sex. And my perspective on it might be different than other people's. And I am always open to hearing other people's perspective on this. But I just want to share some of my ideas because as a trans biologist, I am constantly asked about things like this and expected that I can give a universal answer. And I absolutely cannot. I, as one trans person, can speak for one trans person, but I've had to develop an answer because I'm asked this question so often. So how do we describe gender? The more that I learn about gender, the more unable I feel to give a neat, coherent definition of it. So this is my best attempt. Gender describes a cultural system of categorization that applies specific social norms, expectations, and constraints to individuals who are perceived to belong to culturally recognized gender categories. And I think the most important part of this is that gender always exists within a cultural context. And so gender identity, or how you see yourself, is how you recognize yourself belonging or not belonging to the cultural gender categories present in the society that you live in. How you express your gender is dependent on how different types of things like clothing, hair, and presentation of body shape are interpreted through the gendered lens or the not gendered lens of your particular context. And gender attribution is how other people perceive your gender, again, through a cultural context. And I think gender attribution is pretty important, even though we can't fully control it as individuals, because how other people perceive your gender can significantly influence how you experience your gender and how you generally experience access or safety or not. So the difference between somebody who is a woman who is able to use public women's bathrooms with no issues versus somebody who is equally a woman, but is perceived in such a way that is very hard for her to use public women's bathrooms safely. That's a different experience of attribution, not a different experience of identity, but it has significant impacts for where that person might be able to go and how safe they might be able to feel at a specific school or job. I also want to talk a little bit again about how sex, gender, and sexuality are conflated. So we have our definition of gender and we have our understanding of sex, but thinking about how these things work legally and medically, because of this history of eugenics creating these ideas about sex and gender, and because of the ways that medical establishments are still influenced by these ideas, sex and gender legally and medically often work as binaries. And the way that sex is created, either literally or metaphorically, is based in assumptions of gender, sexuality, and ability. So there's the assumption that somebody needs to be able to have cisgender, heterosexual vaginal intercourse with the goal of reproduction as the best way to have sex or gender. We already saw that in the opinion about why trans care for children is child abuse. And we see that really prominently in care for intersex children. So everybody receives a legal designation of sex and gender at birth. However, intersex children may also receive a physical designation through these involuntary surgeries. And there's this quote that's really awful, but I think really telling, that's from a John Hopkins Magazine article from 1993 that reads, "In truth, the choice of gender still often comes down to what the external genitals look like. Doctors who work with children with ambiguous genitalia sometimes put it this way: you can make a hole, but you can't build a pole. Surgeons can decrease the size of a phallus and create a vagina, but constructing a penis that will grow as a child grows is another matter." And so again, we see the word gender here used to describe something that is a surgery on a sex organ based on the idea that in order to sufficiently participate in the socially constructed male sex and gender, you must have what is considered to be a sufficient phallus. And so these concepts are incredibly complex, but at the same time, often they're boiled down to whether you have what is considered a sufficient phallus or not. And so these are some of my thoughts on how sex and gender interact in ways that we can use to improve our life experience and our relationship with our bodies outside of these binary systems. So I think it is at this point unproductive to say sex and gender are the same thing, but I think it's also unproductive to say that they are completely separate, never interact, and never influence each other on either a personal or political level. I feel very strongly that body parts don't have an inherent sex or gender because of this variation in sex characteristics, and also because people of any gender can have any type of sex characteristics. And another important thing to note is that people change their sex characteristics all the time for many different reasons, in reversible and irreversible ways, in large and small ways. And many times people do this to better match cultural understandings of gendered bodies. So an example of this is sometimes people choose to get breast implants. This is seen as a much bigger deal when transgender women get this than when cisgender women get this. But in both cases, it's modification of a physical sex characteristic to better fit the gendered idea that women have breasts. Another example is that lots of people, including cisgender men, transgender men, non-binary people, and intersex people, take testosterone. And this is changing a biological sex characteristic so that your level of a sex hormone But again, it's seen as something that's a really big deal and in some cases requires significant medical documentation to do for trans people, but is considered pretty easy to access for cis people. I watched the documentary Icarus last night, which is a whole nother topic for a whole nother time, but the filmmaker was able to go to an anti-aging expert and just get testosterone. And if you're a trans person, that's much, much harder to do. And finally, some trans people understand their bodies to be inherently their gender without doing any or certain transition procedures. And there's a quote from the actor India Moore that sums this up really nicely. So India says, if a woman has a penis, her penis is a biologically female penis. And I think the understanding of your own trans body is already being your gender, or the understanding of your trans body better aligning with your gender through medical procedures, I think those things are equally valid. And I want to address something that I know some people disagree with me on, but I feel like this idea of biological gender, which made a lot of headlines, I guess at this point, 2018 is 4 years ago, but this is a really popular sort of pop sci topic, like the idea of trans brains. The way that I think of this is that gender diversity exists across time and across culture. However, the way that we understand gender and categorize gender is culturally specific. Whether gender is important in a specific society for how people are socially organized, how wide or narrow gender roles are, how many genders there are. And our brains are very old. They are much older than contemporary gender roles and contemporary understandings of gender. And not everybody who has been gender diverse has an experience that can be neatly fit into a modern Western idea of transgender. So to argue that brains across time, space, and culture, which don't vary that much, all fit into this specific definition that only has existed for the last half century, I don't think that's a super helpful way to understand gender diversity. There's also potential eugenic implications anytime you try and figure out what makes somebody belong to a marginalized group. There's the potential to try and eliminate that thing and therefore eliminate that group. And also the potential for increased gatekeeping. You already have to jump through a lot of hoops to get transition-related care and a lot of hoops to get things like legal name changes, legal sex marker changes, and the idea that they would make you do a brain scan to prove that you are really trans to be able to access these things is just not helpful. I think in also some cases, people can use this to sort of appropriate intersex identity by claiming that, oh, well, I'm trans because my brain is a different sex than my body. I think that there probably are biological components that lead to people's experiences of gender diversity. But again, I don't think it's one-to-one. You have this type of transgender. And I think that it's also sort of following this eugenic pattern of needing to find a source of what is perceived as social deviancy somewhere in the physical body in order to justify it. Like, I don't care why people are trans. If it makes your life better to identify with a trans identity, I fully support that without it needing to have any biological basis or any analog to intersex traits. And finally, on this topic, I just want to remind us all that sex and gender don't exist in a vacuum. The way that we experience our sex and gender are influenced by our cultural context and by other aspects of our identity, such as race, class, ability or disability, geographic location. And social and environmental factors influence physical and mental health, including how we experience our sex, gender, and sexuality, how we're perceived, and if we can access gender-affirming healthcare. And there's no biological truth about the human experience and human sex that ignores this. And I'm going to take a drink of water. And I really want to emphasize just how biological this is, because I think people often don't think about how if you're a trans person and you need a specific type of gender affirming surgery, but you can't get that surgery because you cannot find a therapist to write a letter who has competency with your ethnic background, because you cannot find healthcare that covers that surgery, because you cannot be employed due to discrimination and you cannot afford your surgery, because you live in a state where the surgeons are all really fat phobic and have BMI cutoffs, so you cannot access your surgery. That influences whether or not you have a specific body part. That can influence whether you have a uterus, which affects your life in multiple ways. That can affect whether you have body parts that will make it more or less safe for you to access certain facilities, including bathrooms. That includes being able to access things like hormones, which can affect whether or not people treat you as your affirmed gender, given that we live in a transphobic and cisnormative society. This is very impactful and very biological, and claiming that this is a humanities topic or this is not science, I think those arguments are unhelpful. So to summarize, biology is a system of knowledge. Variation is inherent in nature. The way we classify it is not neutral. Biological sex is far more diverse than just male and female. The way that we categorize human biological sex has to do with social control. The way that we understand gender has to be in the context of it interacting with sex and other identities within a cultural context. And I have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk about why I give this talk, because I feel like I have been sort of very clinical almost about this. And because this is a trans conference, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about why I'm here and why I do this. And then I will hopefully have some time for questions. So I give this talk because my lifelong love of biology has coexisted alongside a constant sense of being unaccommodated and being a person in question, referencing back to Dr. Ahmed's quote. And some of the reasons that I have often felt unaccommodated and in question is because I'm a queer, trans, and intersex person. And I started a PhD in biology in 2015. At that time, I didn't know I was intersex and I was not out as trans. But as I continued in that program, the specific ways that biology is weaponized against my communities became unignorable. And especially after I came out as trans, it became essential for me to educate myself on where these ideas that are being used to harm my community came from and how to challenge them and how to use my power and my positionality as a biologist to not only challenge them within my workplace and among other scientists, but also help other queer and trans and intersex people understand that a more inclusive and, in my opinion, more accurate and more fun understanding of biological diversity absolutely includes us. And I also want to note that one of the times I gave this talk and talked about story as it relates to topics was at transgender in 2019. And in the 3 years since then, I have been able to come out as intersex and have found intersex community, which has been incredibly life-changing and positive. And I also want to share this just to break down the wall a little bit between me as a scientist who knows things and me as a person in the world who has uncertainty and who grapples with identity and who feels really complicated pain, and how those things are inherently connected. And these are some of my references. If anyone wants my slides, I'm happy to share them. Thank you so much for listening. I really, really appreciate the ability to be part of this event. I encourage you to reach out to me through email or on Twitter or YouTube to continue this conversation. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions or comments. And I'm going to put my Twitter and email in the chat so that I can unshare my screen and we can see each other for the last few minutes to hopefully continue to have a little bit more of an interactive conversation rather than me just talking at you for the entire hour.
Hello, can you hear
Hey.
me?
Yeah.
Hello, I just wanted to say I appreciate this I'm intersex and I do talks on what it's like to be intersex, and often like when I do those talks, like I'm going through the slides and it's like I really just don't know actually really anything. So I just appreciate like an expert in the field like explaining it in simple language, because frequently I just sort of say this is my experience and I don't actually really know a lot about anything else, so I just really appreciate that. And then additionally, I don't know, it's just cool to like meet, as much as you can meet someone on Zoom, another intersex person, because prior I only know one other intersex person. But yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here, and I really appreciate you giving those presentations. That's really important work. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question if no one else does. So
Yeah, go for it.
I personally have been thinking about what if the division between sex and gender itself is also something we should stray away from? And so I just wanted to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I have very complicated thoughts on this because on the one hand, I don't really think the division is useful, because as long as we have that division, then there are going to be people who see sex as more real than gender, which I think is unhelpful. But at the same time, I think there still need to be specific ways to define the needs of intersex people in ways that are separate from trans people who are non-intersex and other endosex people. And I think at this point, it would be very difficult to do that without specific language around sex and sex characteristics as present at or based on birth status. And being able to talk about that very explicitly, I think, is still necessary. If if intersex surgeries were not happening, if there was not this incredibly significant barriers towards intersex adults from getting healthcare, if there was not the inability of intersex people to get accurate documentation, I think maybe we could look more into not having to distinguish those things. But I guess what I've heard from other intersex activists is that that is something that we can want in theory, but it might cause problems in practice right now. But I sort of, for a while, I feel like I was seeing things like, yes, trans men have gender man and sex female. And I think that kind of language is super unhelpful, because what does that even mean, especially for somebody who's medically transitioned? Hopefully that's a helpful answer. I don't know. My thoughts are complicated in this.
I mean, mine are too. So I appreciate anything anyone has to say, especially coming from yourself.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
I'll be running Pikes Peak as a woman in September. I'll have been on HRT for 22 months at that point. All of my friends are all very supportive, and the race registrar is supportive. I have no issues with that, but I just sort of expect questions to come up, whether I hear those questions or not. And I don't know if anyone has any opinions on what advantages I have having grown up as a man with testosterone, but now, just being a woman with a cat.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And good luck with that experience. I am not an expert on human physiology in a way that would allow me to give a really distinct answer about a sort of physiological response to shut people down. I have seen evidence that being on hormones for a year or more would negate any potential physical advantage that having higher testosterone would provide. But testosterone is also not the end of the story when it comes to athletic performance. I read a paper that came out a few years ago comparing testosterone levels of Olympic athletes who are presumably all cisgender and endosex competing in men's and women's Olympic sports, and those ranges actually overlapped. So there's a lot of diversity in every aspect of human physiology, and what makes people good at sports varies a lot. And I also, pre-pandemic, I ran a lot of races, and I would regularly see people who I believe to be cisgender endosex women beat people who are cisgender endosex men, because there's other factors besides testosterone that influence performance. And I really hope that you don't encounter any problems with that. And I hope that the organizers are supportive. And if anyone has other thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them, either by, if you want to unmute yourself, or share them in the chat. Okay, it looks like we have another question that says, what are your thoughts on ways in which we can incorporate this necessary and critical perspective of biology into K-12 education? I think that that can occur at all levels of instruction, in some cases by making small tweaks in language, and in other cases by highlighting examples of ways that biology is not, does not fully conform to what we think of as like a straight cis endosex version. There's lots of different cool examples of this in plants, animals, and fungi. And when we talk about things like puberty and human biology, there's more gender inclusive and sex inclusive ways to do that. I have specific resources about that, some that I made, but a really good resource for that is Gender Inclusive Biology, which is a website run by Sam Long, who I actually met at Transforming Gender 2019, and a few other people. So I can type that in the chat because they actually work in K-12 education. And I used to be a reading teacher for kindergartners in another life, but since I've developed these ideas and this kind of work, it's only mostly been through working with college students.
I have two more questions. Sorry, I didn't want to. If Adrienne is asking a question,
It doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat, so go ahead.
okay. One of them is that like I've never heard. I've always heard 1.7% as like the upper range for like the amount of actual intersex people. I never heard of 5%. So like I was just curious into how you found that out.
Yeah, definitely. So that primarily has to do with hyperandrogenism, which I guess is defined as being somebody born with 46XX chromosomes and ovaries who either has levels of testosterone and other androgens that are considered, again, this is all kind of fuzzy, higher than is typical in an endosex woman, or having physical traits that indicate that. And that hyperandrogenism can be multiple different things. It's known to be caused by congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is traditionally considered to be an intersex variation. It can also be caused by polycystic ovary syndrome, which is not traditionally considered to be an intersex variation, but in some cases, the physical manifestation of these two different traits can be identical. So some people feel like people with hyperandrogenism, regardless of the cause, or even if the cause is not known, have intersex traits that may affect their lives and should be able to be included in intersex.
So I always thought that the 1.7% figure was always presented if we included people with PCOS. So
no, it does not.
Oh, so okay. All right.
Yeah.
I guess also, sorry, you go.
Oh, I guess I was just going to say that the person who I talked to about this was including hyperandrogenic PCOS, which is not all PCOS. So it's based on having the trait rather than having that diagnosis. But what else were you going to say?
I also have two questions, and I'm very scatterbrained because like talking about intersexuality is obviously very sensitive for me. But I always see like 46 or 47 XX. Like, what does that mean? Like, I'm not a biologist by any means, so I'm just always confused when I see that. I'm assuming it's just 23 times 2 or something.
Yes. So humans typically have 22 autosomes or non-sex chromosomes and then 2 sex chromosomes. So 46XX would mean somebody with 46 total chromosomes and 2 X chromosomes as their sex chromosomes. And some people, either because of an intersex variation or something else, will have more than that or less than that. So somebody with Turner syndrome would be 45X or 45X, 46XX mosaic. Somebody with Down syndrome would have 47 chromosomes. Somebody with Klinefelters would have 47 as well. So that's what that refers to.
Okay, cool. Okay. Sorry, I forgot my other question, but well, I've also again, not an expert, but I remember seeing something about how like intersex people often have higher rates of like neurodivergency. And so I was wondering if like there's like a good connection between like neurodivergency and like intersexuality, and also just generally how I saw that and I immediately just thought like, oh, okay, this is just an instance of like the dominant people defining what is culturally normal, just saying like, oh, these people think different than me, so they're like wrong for that, and how that sort of ties into queerness. I don't know. I think I just said a lot of words that don't mean stuff, but I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I've seen some statistics that people who are neurodivergent are more likely to identify as queer or trans, which I think might in part come from just willingness to question the status quo and be open about those things, as opposed to people who put more stake in hierarchies and the status quo and wouldn't ask those questions. I don't necessarily know about intersex. I've also observed that to be true. I don't know if it has to do with in social factor, it has to do with hormones. And again, I think it's potentially very interesting, but I would also be cautious about discussing and researching it again because of the eugenic potential against two populations that are significantly marginalized.
That's true. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and for taking time being here with us today and sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. It was very much appreciated and very, very well done. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.